Maybe someone... Don't worry, I can see people's hands up. Shiran, is there someone that can... Perfect. Is there someone that can take... okay, thank you. I'm going to ask my colleague to take a mic so that we can all hear, including our audience on Zoom can hear the questions. Okay, just a second. Okay, you know what I mean.
I thought Israelis were known for their loud voices.
Okay, yes, so let's go with it. Yes, the gentleman front row.
Thank you for coming today. Was curious to know, with some of the different decisions that have been made in Israel's courts, in the Supreme Court, etc., are there any particular cases that you can think of that have handicapped or even perhaps crippled our arguments on the world stage?
There may very well be some. None necessarily immediately come to mind. I mean, I think the arguments that Israel should be putting forward on the world stage are strong, robust. They're not necessarily always advanced by the state, but they exist. And they ought to be made for the proper application of international law. One case I would highlight, I can actually remember the name, it will come to me, is a very interesting analysis that was conducted by Alon Barak of a previous advisory opinion in relation to Israel, essentially, the 2004 Wall opinion. Now, this was an opinion sought by the International Court of Justice on the security barrier that Israel was building in response to waves of suicide bombings that were ravaging the civilian community. And it was also, of course, essentially 100% successful in stemming that tide of terror. The International Court of Justice, when it considered the construction of the security barrier, didn't address terrorism at all. It didn't consider the security justification for the building of that barrier. On the contrary, it considered it to be part of a land grab. And what Alon Barak did was a very careful analysis of the factual basis that the International Court of Justice adopted in the context of that advisory opinion, and the factual basis that the Supreme Court, sitting as the High Court of Justice, was adopting when considering the very same issue, applications and petitions that had been made to it about the route that the barrier had taken and whether or not that was falling on the right side of the balance that needed to be conducted. So actually, I think that the work of the Supreme Court in many respects in conducting a proper legal analysis, a nuanced approach, and embracing the detail of situations, because in the context of the route of a security barrier, it almost went meter by meter. That difference between Israel's approach and the broad brush, false factual basis, politically driven agenda of the International Court of Justice is really significant. And it's actually one of the issues that we sought to draw out to warn the International Court of Justice this time round, because the first advisory opinion that it sought to give on a false factual basis was such a fiasco.
Thank you. Yes. Also in the front row.
Natasha, you explained very clearly how the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court requested arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant. And you explained how the British government, the current British government, withdrew the objections on jurisdiction. And as you said, you and many others, maybe 50 other people, were given permission by the chamber that's examining that request to make submissions. And obviously, some are on your side, some are on the other side. But that's an awful lot of submissions, which presumably have to be analysed. And then I think the prosecutor is entitled to respond. Now, what do you read into the approach of the three judges in this pre-trial chamber in allowing so many submissions on both sides of the argument of jurisdiction? At the very least, would you say that this is delaying a decision? And do you think that they are looking for an opportunity to perhaps explain to Karen Khan, the prosecutor, that it's not quite as simple as he may have imagined on the basis of the advice he took from the people he chose to ask?
I think that's what's called a leading question. My advocacy course was a long time ago, though. Joshua, I think you may be onto something there. But there is an alternative way of looking at this, which is that the court wants to make sure it is conducting a thorough analysis, and to the extent that there are interested parties, academics, NGOs, states, member states, or otherwise, that wish to draw aspects of the analysis to the court's attention, it's only proper that it considers that position carefully, not least because I mentioned that individual liberties are at stake. But it's very interesting that this will inevitably have a delay effect. It highlights the very strange timing of Karim Khan's application, because albeit I mentioned quite a bit about the concept of jurisdiction and whether or not the ICC has jurisdiction to entertain these arrest warrant applications, there is another fundamental principle that the International Criminal Court operates on, and that is called the principle of complementarity, which means that the court will not engage in a situation if a state that has jurisdiction, in this case Israel, is willing or able to investigate and, if necessary, prosecute whatever credible allegations exist. Now, in the context of the continuing war in the Gaza Strip, it's absolutely inconceivable that the principle of complementarity can have been given any consideration here whatsoever. It's been suggested publicly that Karim Khan made this application, and clearly he thought he was adopting some sort of very English approach here by going after both sides. It's unfortunate that the analysis didn't go to the extent of understanding what those both sides are. The democratic leadership of the only democracy in the Middle East, and an internationally prescribed terrorist organisation. The moral equivalence that is essentially driven at by this dual application is really repugnant. It has been suggested that the prosecutor wasn't anticipating the backlash that he has suffered as a result of this. After going on Christian Amanpour, after seeking, I suppose, to present himself as a champion of international justice, international criminal justice, there has been a significant backlash and a lot of criticism. And this is also despite the fact that very uncharacteristically, in a rather unprecedented fashion, he also sought the rubber stamping of a panel of quote-unquote experts, Amal Clooney included, probably the best known here, experts that by all accounts have based their assessment on the same inaccurate information that appears in the prosecutor's own summary of his application. So what value or use that endorsement has is deeply unclear. But in the context of the timing of this, before there can have been any, the dust hasn't settled, before there can have been any investigation, any analysis even by Israel, really does suggest that if the pre-trial chamber is seeking to delay the decision that it will inevitably have to make on these arrest warrants, then this would be a reason for it. But of course, one way of dealing with this is just to chuck it out. Because of the timing, because of the failure to consider complementarity, and because of the inaccuracies that we and others have pointed out, that would be an alternative approach. So the softly delayed analysis of the submissions that you've made to it is perhaps an alternative to that.
Okay, let's go from this side. So I'll make you do a bit of exercise here. So maybe en route you can go to this gentleman in the front.
Ms. Hausdorff, I was curious about a question having to do with the definition of occupied territories. we, to tell you, withdrew from Gaza at the time, and we claimed that it's no longer occupied. I understand that several international organizations, including the United Nations, claim that Gaza, even before the war, that Gaza was still occupied because we control the airspace and the sea access for Gaza. Since then, since the war started, there's been added claims I've seen that since the IDF effectively controls Gaza, that even more so, it's still considered occupied. I read the Article 42 of the Hague Regulations of 1907, which in one sentence says territory is considered occupied when it is actually placed under the authority of the hostile army, ... and can be exercised. So, first of all, I don't understand, and I've searched desperately, what it actually means when when the territory is placed under the authority of the hostile army. What does under the authority of the hostile army mean? And has that definition from the Hague Regulations of 1907, has that been changed someplace in order to enable the claims that Gaza is still under occupation?
There's a lot of lawyers in the audience tonight.
I have no experience.
That's totally fine. That's totally fine.
In a word, yes. We weren't expecting a short answer. Okay, so pre-withdrawal, the analysis of the status of the territory ultimately also, I think, has to come down to the proper application of uti possidetis juris. Because we talked about the West Bank being covered from Jordan, the same thing applies when you look at the boundaries of the mandate before the establishment of the State of Israel vis-a-vis Egypt. Israel recovered that territory. The Sinai that it occupied from Egypt was returned, but not so with Gaza. So I would question the application of the legal term occupation to Gaza before the withdrawal as a starting point. Even Israelis, of course, have referred to occupation, I think somewhat misguidedly, probably not in a legal context, as a political term. But after the withdrawal, we have a more interesting phenomenon, because of course, you can have abandonment of territory. Israel could say it has resigned any claim that it has to the Gaza Strip. And I think there is an argument to suggest that is what unilateral withdrawal in 2005 was about. What you refer to in the Hague Regulations of the definition of effective control, the hostile army is defined in relation to, in a general context, the territory, because you are occupying the territory of a former sovereign, but also the population. And it's in that context that the Geneva Conventions apply and a separate framework of what you as an occupier are allowed to do or not to do. But the reason I said yes is because what we have seen subsequently in relation to the claims that the blockade constituted effective control, which in many other respects is referred to also as boots on the ground, the twisting of the concept of occupation to apply to Israel instituting a naval blockade or a land blockade according to its border. I don't need to tell this audience that Gaza also shares a border with Egypt. And we've seen with the taking of Rafah, the enormous tunnels through which Hamas has been stockpiling and supplying its terror infrastructure. The notion that Israel had any control over that, effective control, is utterly ludicrous. But we have seen a twisting, as I say, a development, a rewriting. Do you remember directly or indirectly? This is another example of how international law is being manipulated in order to use charges against Israel in a way that is just not applicable anywhere else. When we look at post the 7th of October and Israel's presence, I think it is interesting to recognize the military strategy that Israel has adopted, because it has been in different sectors of Gaza and withdrawn. It has not, in fact, established effective control throughout this military campaign. It is a very different approach. Colonel Richard Kemp, John Spencer have written actually quite extensively about the military tactics that Israel has deployed. Andrew Fox had a recent article in The Spectator, another extremely insightful military expert who's been on the ground with the IDF and has analysed Israel's approach. It's quite the contrary from the sort of US-style occupation, fighting an insurgency. And so the argument that Israel is in any way occupying the Gaza Strip, either before 2005 or today, is utterly ludicrous. But it comes with a wholesale refusal to recognise actual applicable international law. And I think when we talk about the border with Egypt, it's important to recognise, I've not heard anyone talk about this, Egypt's responsibilities to facilitate the safe passage of refugees out of Gaza. Under the African Union Convention on Refugees, which Egypt acceded to in 1980, which has a much broader definition of refugee than the International Convention on Refugees. It includes anyone fleeing civil disorder. I read that as Egypt having a responsibility to facilitate the safe passage of anyone fleeing civil disorder in the Gaza Strip, any civilian that presented themselves on the border at Rafah, Egypt has a responsibility to. Now, when we consider the ease with which, I'm not talking about the Egyptian state absorbing these refugees, the same way that Israel absorbed waves of refugees of Jews from the Arab world when they were persecuted, subject to pogroms. I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting the humanitarian zones that Israel has been, in conjunction with many international organizations, seeking to establish in the Gaza Strip, which have been abused by Hamas, who are firing missiles at Israeli civilians from within these humanitarian areas. Setting up a humanitarian zone in Egyptian Rafah, the other side of the border, away from Hamas infiltration, away from Hamas's diversion of aid to these people, that, to me, is a no-brainer. And when I hear responsible international representatives talking about their concern for the plight of the Palestinians, and I do not hear them making the demand that Egypt comply with its obligations under international law and provide what I have outlined, I can't take their protestations seriously. Because if people really cared about the provision of humanitarian aid to individual Palestinians, which Hamas is diverting, people cared about preserving the lives, despite the precautions that Israel is taking in Gaza, then that would be the first call. And despite that, we've seen the border with Egypt being ignored, Egypt's responsibilities being ignored, and international law being completely twisted to make it all Israel's responsibility. If you step back and you see that there's no way that Israel can win here, there's nothing that Israel could possibly have done. It withdrew from that territory entirely, and Hamas created a terror state there, and yet Israel is still being blamed for breaking international law as a result, in a way that is ultimately twisted and, I'm afraid, not reflective of what established international law says.
You expanded quite a bit on your initial yes. But that was very useful. Okay, let's have a woman. Lena.
Hi. First of all, I want to say thank you for this very interesting speech, but also all the interviews which you were given before. I remember how shortly after October 7 I was watching BBC. Very hard was for me to believe what I was listening to. And all of a sudden I remember seeing your interview, and personally just emotionally for me it was very important to hear your beautiful British English, very structured. Honestly, thank you for that. So I have two questions. My first one is, I do believe that very connected to Lawfare were also media wars. And it's very hard to find objective information, and we're all living in bubbles. And because of social media and YouTube, it's only becoming stronger and stronger. So you addressed a number of points where you were saying why Israel is not committing war crimes or just generally acting in a favor of international law. Would you say that some of the points which people raising around the world are correct, and there are some aspects when Israel does violate international law, small aspects, big aspects, I don't know. Yeah, probably that was my only question. Thank you.
It's a very interesting question. And actually, when I was first seeking to address these issues of interviews, some of the advice I had from respected members of the international media was that if I was going to have any success of getting on anywhere, I needed to accept, to acknowledge that Israel broke international law. And then I might be able to explain some of the nuances. And I said I cannot accept or say something that is not true. And I'm not here to say that Israel is perfect. Certainly, I know even in the context of this auditorium, there will probably be multiple different kinds of criticisms, maybe even contradictory ones, of policies from the same person, of policies implemented by the Israeli government. But breaches of international law are, it seems to me, somewhat anathema to the way that Israel positions itself in the international arena. The application of international law, even as a matter of the domestic jurisdiction, is relatively unprecedented. The way that Israeli courts embrace and apply international law, it's not the case in the UK. And so the level of literacy amongst the legal fraternity, the standards at which the Attorney General's office, the legal advisors of the government hold the government to, are pretty nigh unprecedented. If you really were to push me, I mean, it's a question of domestic law as opposed to international law. I was thinking about the maritime border with Lebanon. There were lots of issues as to the controversy as to whether or not that was in fact a legal matter for the government to be able to decide without either a referendum or proper, more broad consensus within the Knesset. So I'm certainly not saying that Israel has an absolute pristine record card, but the allegations that we hear being levelled at Israel, I have yet to encounter one which has legs. And you know, I'm I think a reasonable person. I'll often read the newest set of allegations, often based on facts, and I'll think, oh my goodness, how horrendous. Let's look into this. Let's interrogate what it is that is being reported here, because if it is true, that is utterly diabolical. And without exception, in every one of those instances, there has been some twisting or some explanation as to why what is being reported is not reflective of the reality. And so I say never, but I've yet to come across, and something that I'm now increasingly spending a lot of time reading and marinating in. And I have to say that the answer at this juncture is I'm still waiting to see.
Wait, just to... Oh, sorry, Mum. I should be clear. My mother had a hand up, and I said, so I'm going to get in a lot of trouble. I might have to revise this. No, I don't want to take. I'm not going to take it away from you. We're going to have 3 questions. The gentleman here and my mother. I apologize.
Sorry, Mum.
This is.
I actually wasn't going to ask a question until this last point that you made. I was trying to find it, but I can't find it now. Just literally a few hours ago, I was reading in the Times about Netanyahu having said that he wouldn't see David Lammy because of the position David Lammy took about the ICJ, which obviously you'll be familiar with. Now, the part that really worried me was that apparently, I don't know whether it's someone in Ireland, but it's someone, I'll find it, that he's having huge pressure put on him, David Lammy, by this person who I'm just about to find. saying that Israel has committed genocide in Gaza, continues to commit genocide. How can this be disproved? How, as a lawyer, can you or your organisation do something to stop this constant refrain of genocide? It's really upsetting for us to read it as well, because after a while we feel we need to really look into it. You know, that's the question.
I'm going to break the rule on taking the questions together, just because this is such a big one, and it's just occurred to me that it's remiss on my part that we've not actually addressed the elephant in the room yet. This allegation of genocide. What is genocide? This was a term coined by Raphael Lemkin after the Holocaust to provide legal terminology to the Jewish experience, which is being targeted because you are a Jew. There is an intentional aspect to the crime of genocide which is critical. It is the intentional targeting of a group, in whole or in part, an ethnic, racial, religious or national group, and subjecting them to a number of listed acts, including killing or creating circumstances that essentially make life impossible. But that intentional focus on destroying a group in whole or in part. It's monstrous that this allegation is being alleged, is being levied towards Israel. Of course it's palpably false. But it strikes me that South Africa, in making it, and others, if they're encouraging Lamy and the Foreign Secretary to take this seriously, are not really peddling in the realities of this or the law. There's not a realistic expectation that the court, the International Court of Justice, is conducting itself with any sense of integrity, that it will find at the merit stage in this case that Israel has conducted genocide. There's a very different agenda here in levying this term against Israel, and it was made clear to me. I was on the South African version of the BBC immediately after the 26th of January Provisional Measures Order, and my counterpart said, "Isn't it wonderful? Now we can finally use Israel and genocide in the same sentence and nobody can tell us otherwise." And on that basis, the claim that South Africa has brought, the PR circus that we have witnessed playing out, has been unbelievably successful. It has completely shifted the Overton window. It has changed the parameters of the debate. It is now acceptable to even talk about genocide as a possibility here. And the reason it is so pernicious is because this is another example of the victims of real genocide being accused of the crime that was committed against them. I don't just mean the victims of genocide in the Holocaust, the Jews. I mean the victims on the 7th of October of acts of genocide committed and celebrated by Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, elements of Fatah, and other non-affiliated individuals who crossed the border, with the intention of killing and torturing, raping, maiming Jews because they were Jews.
Sorry, Natasha, I just want to tell you, just for you, I don't need a microphone, I just want Natasha to know. Last week, Mark Smith, a counter-terrorism official of the British Embassy in Dublin, resigned in protest over continuing arms sales to Israel, putting huge pressure on David Lammy. When you look at what constitutes a war crime, it's actually quite clear from every source that the state of Israel is perpetrating war crimes in plain sight on BBC Radio 4. Anyone who has any basic understanding can see that war crimes are being committed, not once, twice, or a few times, but quite frequently, openly and regularly. This is the kind of thing that
Thank you for the update. Okay. All right. So I hope this is a Jewish audience. No one's going to begrudge me giving questions to my mother, I assume. If lest anyone not have any sympathy, I should tell you that she's here for my daughter's bat mitzvah. Mum, go.
Yes. The conversation today has been nearly all about Gaza. Can I just bring in the West Bank, about the situation in the West Bank, legally and otherwise? Because I hate hearing about what's going on there, with illegal settlements and paintings of Arab villages and all that sort of stuff.
You might get me in trouble. Yeah, sorry, continue.
That's
Okay, that's
yes,
the
the
question.
question about
The legal ramifications of that?
ramifications, yes,
Okay.
of what's going on in the West
So I spoke about the legal status of the territory at the outset. That's pivotal to how you assess what Israel is doing in Judea and Samaria today, well, from 1967 to today, in the context also of the Oslo Accords. The notion that settlements are illegal is predicated, firstly, on the false application of occupation to the status of the territory. But even if you were to ignore all of that, it is a perversion of the article of the 4th Geneva Convention that I mentioned, the prevention or prohibition on the transfer of individuals into occupied territory. Article 49.6, which was drafted to reflect the Jewish experience of forced transfer by the Nazis, is being twisted in order to try to criminalize the presence of Jews who have moved to Judea and Samaria, not as a result of forced government transfer, but of their own volition, as I mentioned earlier, and as an expression of their free will, sometimes even contrary to what the government is seeking to implement. You know, there are illegal, actual, unlawful settlements that are built without planning permission, that are unregularized, that are taken down by the state, and that are subject to legal determinations by the Supreme Court, sitting as the High Court of Justice. So that is the primary difficulty, that the whole allegation of illegal settlements is predicated first on a misreading of the status of the territory, and second on a misapplication of this Article 49.6. But the truly repugnant aspect of all of this is that it is a reflection of a morally problematic standpoint, which says that Jews shouldn't live in certain areas simply because they are Jews. The legal analysis here is unworkable. So ultimately it is this policy position that is at the centre of the criticisms that we hear about settlements. That the West Bank should be Judenrein. We've seen what happened with areas A and B, territory that was subject to the Palestinian Authority's control. Everyone here is familiar with the red signs outside Area A, warning any Israelis to go in. Everyone here is also familiar with the Ramallah lynching to Israelis that lost their way, that were subject to horrific practices. And that photograph of one of the lynchers holding his bloody hands up to the window to the baying crowd beneath. That is what underpins the monstrous twisting, I think, of the international legal position to seek to justify this position that Jews should not be living there, or that this territory should be mine. And I think in that context, it's important to frame both what is happening on the ground in the West Bank and also the international coverage of it. Ultimately, it is a very delicate balance for Israel to have to try and, if you will, police, albeit it's not the proper application of the law, domestic law that would entail policing. There is a military presence there, which is within the framework of the internationally agreed Oslo Accords. But what you do see is law that is applied in accordance with the framework that Israel has established, and that was maintained by Oslo. So, for example, one of the allegations that is made against Israel in terms of apartheid or the differentiation or discrimination is the application of military courts in Judea and Samaria, which is itself a reflection of the requirements of the Geneva Conventions, which Israel has applied in part, that mean that those non-citizens of Israel have to be tried in military courts, whereas any Israelis living in the area are subject to Israeli civil criminal jurisdiction, as they would be if they were living anywhere else in the world. So again, all of these misrepresentations about the legal status of the territory and the legal framework that is applied necessarily infect, for want of a better word, the misinformation that we're hearing coming out of the West Bank even today.
Yeah, I think there's an important distinction between the legal debate and the political debate, especially the internal Israeli debate, to be discussed at the right time. Okay, I want to wait. Let's just give. No, you good? Watch it. Okay. Okay. So we're gonna call it a day. I apologise for those that had their hands up. Natasha's going to hang around for a little bit for people that want to approach her with questions. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you all for joining us on Zoom. We have more events in the coming weeks, so check out the website, our Facebook page as well. If you're not on my mailing list, drop me an email, paulg@begincentre.org.il. I also want to add, I request that 9 gentlemen stay behind to make a minyan for Joe Kislovich, who is davening for his mother's yahrzeit. So if we can have a minyan here afterwards right now, that would be very helpful. He's promised me he's a very quick davener. So let's get it done. Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you so much, Natasha.
For you.